Being wrong can be a beautiful thing. It is your job as a scientist to not just question other people's ideas, but it is your job to question your own ideas. Let's talk about fasted cardio. Branched chain amino acids, LDL cholesterol and saturated fat, sugar, as in like sucrose, table sugar, fructose, and high fructose corn syrup. Final thing I changed my mind on, artificial sweeteners. I'm always open to the idea that I could be wrong. What's up? Welcome back to the Dr. Lane Norton Show. I am your host, Lane Norton. This is the show where we make science simple and fun. Today, I want to talk about something that I think is really important for a good evidence-based scientist and also for you all to hear. And these are the things that I have changed my mind on. Things I once felt relatively strongly about that I later changed my mind. I had a really great PhD advisor named Dr. Don Layman. And one of the things he told me was that it is your job as a scientist to not just question other people's ideas, but it is your job to question your own ideas, question your own beliefs or things that you believe to be true continuously. And a lot of it was, we just didn't mind being wrong in that lab. If we were wrong, cool, we were going to learn something. And one of the things I want to tell you guys is that being wrong can be a beautiful thing. Let me explain. If you are right about everything, if your ideas are right about everything that you have beliefs about, then you are maxed out. There's no room for improvement. But if you're wrong about something, you have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and this applies to not just nutrition, training, health. This applies to all areas of life. And so I think if we could just embrace the idea of it's okay to be wrong. And quite frankly, throughout the first part of my graduate school experience and throughout a lot of it, I was wrong a lot. I got a lot of stuff wrong. And by the end, I just didn't have a problem being wrong. Now, I like being right. Don't get me wrong. I like being right. I'll do cartwheels in my living room if I'm right about something. But if I'm wrong about something, it's not the end of the world, because as a scientist, I have the ability to change my mind based on evidence. If someone is not willing to change their mind based on evidence, that person is not a scientist. They're not evidence-based. They're a politician. Those are things that politicians do. They defend beliefs in the face of overwhelming evidence. And unfortunately for a lot of people, evidence is not sufficient to change beliefs. Let me give you an example, and this is actually a political example. There was a study done, I think, in the late aughts, so around 2008, 2009. And they looked at both Republicans and Democrats. So if you're outside the USA, these are the two main political parties. And they showed members of each party information or evidence that would either refute or support a pre-existing belief that they held. And what they found was there was no difference between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how this worked out. But evidence that refuted their position or evidence that supported their position were equally as effective at reinforcing their beliefs. Let me say that one more time. If they saw hard evidence that they were wrong, they didn't change their mind. They actually became more entrenched in their belief system. If they saw evidence that they were right, they became more entrenched in their belief system. And so being able to think like a scientist requires you to almost go against your human nature. We are tribal by nature. It's part of our survival mechanism. We have to protect our own, and we have to be careful about them, about they. Because they might want to come take our stuff. They might want to come hurt us. And so this kind of relic of survival from thousands and thousands of years ago is still present in how we communicate information to each other, which is we tend to fall into our belief system and fully entrench ourselves there and be not willing to change our minds. And if you are a good scientist, if you are a legitimate scientist, you will be able to tell me things that you changed your mind on. And so what I wanted to do today was go through things that I've changed my mind on and explain to you why I changed my mind on those things. And that being said, I want to point out, no single study is going to make me change a belief I have about something. No single study is going to make me completely flip-flop. This happens slowly for me. Over time, I see more and more evidence, and I slowly change my mind. My belief shifts over time because you don't just want to flip-flop based on one study, because single studies can be very unreliable. You want to look at the consensus of the evidence. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the abridged version of things, but I want to point out a few things that I've changed my mind on, because I think you guys hearing this, maybe it will help you make better decisions and possibly make you more open to changing your minds. And one of my favorite quotes is, "You should be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out." There are limits here, and things exist on a continuum. So you want to be open to the idea that you could be wrong. You also don't just want to flip-flop based on insufficient evidence. You want to have sufficient evidence. But if you're not willing to change your mind, then you're definitely not a scientist. You may have a PhD, you may be a physician, you may teach at a university. But if you are not willing to change your mind, fundamentally, you are the antithesis of a good evidence-based scientist. And I'll just give you one example that I saw in person years ago, 10 years ago, actually. I was at a fitness expo called Body Power. And as part of that fitness expo, there was something called the Ultimate Evidence-Based Fitness Summit. And I was there along with people like Brad Schoenfeld, Alan Aragon, Brett Contreras. And Alan Aragon was debating Gary Taubes. Now, Alan has a master's in nutrition. He's very smart, written a lot of research literature, been involved in quite a few studies. Gary Taubes is someone who became famous as a journalist who moved into writing books, basically touting the benefits of low carb, and then went on to form a research organization called NUSI that funded studies that were going to prove what he believed to be true about carbs, which was carbs are fattening, carbs are bad, and low carb diets are better than other diets for weight loss. And funny enough, his own studies disproved what he believed to be true, and he still believed what he believed. And during that conference, Alan was presenting all of this evidence that was systematically refuting the points that Gary was making. At one point, Alan said, I think out of frustration, talking about the research that Gary was going to fund because they hadn't taken place yet, or they were in the process of happening at that time. Alan said, and if these studies don't support what you believe, if they show the opposite thing, will you change your mind? And Gary said no. And then Alan said, so what amount of evidence would you need? Can you tell me what amount of evidence you would need to change your mind? And it kind of went back and forth, but essentially Gary basically said there was nothing that was going to change his mind. Then why are we having this conversation? Those convinced against their will are of the same opinion still. So I'm hoping to plant the seeds in your mind throughout this episode that it's okay to change your mind, that it's okay to evolve your thought process with evidence, because that's what a good scientist does. And it shows a certain amount of humility to be able to admit that something that you believe to be true was not. So let's get into this. First thing I'm going to cover that I changed my mind on is branched chain amino acids, BCAAs. Now, what are BCAAs for those of you who are not familiar? So branched chain amino acids are essential amino acids that have some unique properties to them. There's three: leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And one of the unique characteristics of BCAAs is they really aren't touched much by first pass metabolism. So the gut and liver tend to be very greedy with most amino acids, and they extract decent amounts of them when they're taken in through the diet. But BCAAs kind of get a pass. Typically what winds up in the blood is pretty reflective of what's in the diet. And they also can be directly metabolized and oxidized in the muscle for energy. So those are some unique characteristics of BCAAs. And when I went to graduate school, that's what I wanted to study. In fact, I remember the way I found Dr. Layman was I went to PubMed and typed in leucine skeletal muscle protein synthesis. And his was one of the first papers that came up. Branched chain amino acids, specifically leucine, had been shown to activate this complex called mTOR, which mTOR is the mammalian target of rapamycin. Leucine had been shown to stimulate mTOR, and mTOR essentially is part of a signaling cascade that the end result is an increase in muscle protein synthesis. And that was very interesting to me. Seemed pretty straightforward. You give leucine or BCAAs, more energy for the muscle, and you get an increase in muscle protein synthesis. Should be able to grow more muscle. So let me just explain a little bit of how this works and how these things tie into muscle protein synthesis. So muscle protein synthesis is what it sounds like, the process of creating new muscle proteins or synthesizing new muscle proteins. The rate limiting step of muscle protein synthesis is something called translation initiation. Every protein that your body makes is encoded in your DNA. And if you took high school biology, you probably learned about transcription and translation. So your DNA can be transcribed, which is where the DNA is unwound, to produce an RNA or an mRNA, which is messenger RNA. That mRNA can then be translated into a protein. So I'm kind of simplifying this process. But the rate limiting step to make new muscle proteins is the translating of that mRNA. And the translation is done by what's called a ribosome. And a ribosome reads the mRNA, and based on the sequence of the nucleotides in the mRNA, it brings in specific amino acids in a specific sequence and hooks them together. And over time, this produces a protein. In the case of muscle protein synthesis, it's producing muscle proteins. And specifically in the translation step, the rate limiting step for that to occur is a complex called EIF4F. And EIF4F is essentially a scaffold for the ribosome to hook onto that mRNA. And the rate limiting step of the formation of EIF4F is the association of two proteins called EIF4E and EIF4G. mTOR, when stimulated by leucine or resistance training or whatever, then phosphorylates a binding protein called 4EBP1. 4EBP1 typically binds up and makes unavailable EIF4E and EIF4G. So they don't associate it with each other when the binding protein is high. When mTOR is stimulated, it phosphorylates that binding protein, which inactivates it essentially. And now EIF4E and EIF4G can hook up. And it also phosphorylates EIF4G, which makes it have a greater affinity for EIF4E. Okay, so that increases the formation of this complex, causes the formation of EIF4F, so the ribosome can hook on to that mRNA and make those proteins. Leucine also stimulates something called the ribosomal protein S6 kinase. And that particular signaling complex increases the production of proteins specifically involved in this whole process. So kind of like ramps up the capacity for production of proteins. Long story short, leucine, the branched amino acid leucine, had been shown to be basically responsible for the anabolic effects of protein, the leucine content of proteins. And my PhD thesis, which you can see sitting right back there over my left shoulder, was looking at intact protein sources and relating their leucine contents to whether or not the leucine content of those protein sources could predict the effects on muscle protein synthesis when given as part of like complete meals. And spoiler alert, yes, the leucine content was indicative of the synthetic response of muscle proteins in response to those complete meals. So I have a bias towards leucine and branched chain amino acids because I started supplementing with branched chains, I think like back in 2002. And from 2004 till 2014, I was sponsored by a company named Scivation, which sold a product called Extend, which contained branched chain amino acids, which I used and believed in and advocated for. Then in 2015, I co-founded a supplement company in a partnership with bodybuilding.com that was called Carbon Supplements. And one of our products contained branched chain amino acids. So I'm telling you this because I want to show you that I had a very heavy bias towards branched chain amino acid supplementation for over a decade. My new company, Outwork Nutrition, we have a recovery product. And in my old company, Carbon Supplements, our recovery product had branched chain amino acids in them. My new recovery product does not have BCAAs. Why is that? First off, a lot of new research came out showing that while branched amino acids and leucine could increase muscle protein synthesis in humans, it didn't appear to increase muscle mass. So you can give as many BCAAs and leucine as you want. It doesn't appear to increase muscle mass, especially in the context of someone consuming a high protein diet. And research has also demonstrated that compared to intact protein sources like whey protein with an equivalent amount of BCAAs, that the whey protein is actually more anabolic, even with the same branched chain amino acid content. Now, while branched chains don't increase lean body mass, there is evidence that they may have an anti-catabolic effect. So during periods of caloric restriction, during periods of disease where muscle protein breakdown is elevated, during various catabolic situations, BCAAs may be able to attenuate that catabolism, but they do not appear to be anabolic in humans to building muscle. So when I started my new supplement company, Outwork Nutrition, back in 2020, I left BCAAs out. Even though so many people asked me, when are you going to have a BCAA product? Because I just couldn't justify their usage. Enough evidence had come out that I felt like I could no longer justify supplementing with branched chain amino acids. And as somebody who had personally supplemented with them for probably about 15 years, I had to change my mind on this. So I stopped supplementing with them. Now, there is some evidence they can reduce delayed onset muscle soreness. Great. I think for most people, they don't make sense. They're not worth the money. And hey, I had to eat crow on that one. I believed them in for over a decade, probably a decade and a half. Recommended them to people. People probably spent a lot of money on these things because of me. And looks like I was wrong. So, got to put a check mark in the L column for me there. What else? Let's talk about fasted cardio. When I did my first bodybuilding show in 2001, I performed fasted cardio for that entire prep. And I advocated for fasted cardio on the message boards. And I also did it for my prep in 2002. Why fasted cardio? Well, the idea is in a fasting state, your body is going to have to draw on your stored body fat for energy. If you eat beforehand, your body is going to use that for fuel and you won't burn that body fat. And indeed, preliminary research did indicate that if you did exercise in a fasted state, your rate of fat oxidation was higher than in a fed state. But then at some point, I had a discussion with a friend of mine on the message boards somebody I respected, smart guy named Eugene. I can't remember his last name, unfortunately. So Eugene, if you end up watching this, shout out to you. And he got me questioning whether or not fasted cardio was actually superior. And he did a good job of thinking in like an overall context. And kind of the summation of that is, okay, so you're burning more fat during your exercise. Okay. What about the rest of the day? Because if you don't eat before your exercise, that means throughout the course of the rest of the day, you have to eat more food, which will have a blunting effect on fat oxidation. If you eat before exercise, maybe you burn less fat during the exercise, but then you have less food you're eating throughout the course of the day because you've already had one of your meals, and over a 24-hour period, you're probably netting out about the same. And I kind of dug into the research, and there really was no data to support fasted cardio being superior to fed cardio when studies measured the actual loss of body fat. And we're going to get into mechanisms versus outcomes in the future, but it's important to point out something like fat oxidation is a mechanism. Fat oxidation or fat burning is not the same thing as the loss of actual body fat. Those are two different things, because the loss of body fat is a balance between the amount of fat you burn versus the amount of fat you store. If you store more than you burn, you gain body fat. If you burn more than you store, you lose body fat. If they're about the same, then you maintain. And so you can burn more fat, but if you're storing more fat, it's not going to make a difference. Now, that doesn't really apply to this situation particularly, but we'll talk more about that in future episodes when it comes to, like, say, low carb versus low fat diets. So there have been several studies and meta-analyses looking at, okay, if we have people do the same amount of cardio and eat the same amount of calories, does one group lose more fat than another group? And the answer to that question is no. So regardless of that mechanism of fat oxidation, it is obviously compensated somewhere else. Now, I even went on to say, well, fasted cardio is actually worse because you're not eating beforehand, so you're probably not going to be as fueled. You won't have as good a performance. Your cortisol is going to be higher. They do show that exercising fasted raises your cortisol more than exercising in a fed state, which I always found it funny because bodybuilders would always say, oh, make sure you eat something right when you get up because you got to get anabolic. You don't want to be without more than 2 hours without food because you'll lose muscle. And yet they'd get up and do fasted cardio. So I started to say, it's not any better and actually might be worse. And then now I've kind of swung back to, I think there's really no difference. If 24-hour energy intake and macros are equated between groups doing fasted versus fed cardio, it doesn't appear to have an effect on body composition. Both appear to be equally effective for fat loss. So what that says is one approach probably is superior than another, and do what you prefer. If you like getting up and doing fasted cardio first thing in the morning before you eat anything, just roll out and do it. Great. If you're somebody like me who I want to eat right when I wake up, you can do that too. One does not, or do your cardio in the afternoon. One does not appear to be more effective than the other. Next thing I changed my mind on, high intensity cardio versus low intensity cardio. When I say high intensity cardio, typically people talk about high intensity interval cardio. It's not always referred to that way, but most people doing like really high intensity, you can't do really high intensity for any long period of time. So they're kind of referring to interval training for the most part. So kind of like fasted cardio, I originally recommended low intensity cardio because the idea was, well, high intensity cardio is going to cause you to burn muscle and low intensity cardio will spare muscle. Also, low intensity cardio, you burn a greater percentage of your energy from fat, whereas high intensity cardio, you burn more from glucose. So makes sense, right? You want to burn more fat because you will lose more fat. But as we talked about, fat oxidation is not the same thing as the actual loss of body fat. But the devil's advocate argument for this went something like this too. Well, high intensity cardio is actually more analogous towards what you do in the gym, which is very anaerobic. And so if you're going to do any cardio, it should be high intensity and short because you can burn more calories in a short period of time. You end up spending a lot less time doing the high intensity work. So that will spare muscle. And it's more analogous to what you do with resistance training. So what actually is the truth? Well, when it comes to the actual loss of body fat, based on the research data, there's really no difference when you equate for total work between the two treatments. So when I say equate for total work, what I mean is, for example, let's say you did 15 intervals of sprinting, and that means you would have ran a mile. If you walk that same mile, you would have burned essentially the same amount of calories and lost the same amount of body fat. The work is the same. So which one should you do? Low intensity, moderate intensity, high intensity, which one's better? Well, one isn't blanket better than the other for fat loss. They all appear to work about the same, again, when you equate for work. There's just trade-offs. So with high intensity, it can be very appealing because you can do it in a shorter period of time. Maybe you can bang through it in 15, 20 minutes and you're done. Low intensity, you might have to go for over an hour to get the same amount of energy expenditure. But high intensity is more fatiguing, not just physically, but also mentally. I can tell you that for my high intensity sessions when I was prepping for shows, I would kind of like have to psych myself up to go out and do car pushes and sprints and whatnot. But just going out and walking for an hour, whatever, I could go do that. I think a lot of this boils down to personal preference. And if you're doing walking or low intensity cardio, hey, you can listen to a podcast or you can read a book. Or, if you got one of those walking desks, you could even do some work while you're doing your cardio. Multitask. You're not multitasking while you're sprinting, I'll tell you that. And for some people, particular forms of cardio like sprints may make you sore, which could impede some subsequent resistance training sessions. So again, there's no clear winner here. There's just trade-offs with both. So my recommendations are, again, do what makes sense for you. Maybe you're doing a combination of both, depending on how you feel on a certain day. Or just do what you enjoy, whatever you will be consistent with and stick to. Many people ask me what supplements I take, and that's easy. I take the supplements that I formulate and created for my supplement line, Outwork Nutrition. You see, I started Outwork Nutrition because I was frustrated by the lack of transparency in the supplement industry. So many companies were using proprietary blends to hide the fact that they were drastically underdosing their products. And as a research nutrition scientist, I know what having a proper dosage means when it comes to these ingredients. And I knew that many of these companies were just ripping people off. That's when I decided to create my own line of science-based supplements that were good enough to support my training. As someone who has won 5 national titles and 2 world titles in powerlifting and set 2 world records in powerlifting and trains for 2 to 3 hours a day, I needed supplements that would support my hard, intense training and recovery. All Outwork Nutrition products are based on the latest scientific evidence, and every ingredient is included at the proper clinical dose for maximum effectiveness. We provide links to all the scientific research and ingredients and claims on our website, so you don't have to take our word for it. You can read it for yourself. No proprietary blends, no BS marketing hype, no empty promises. Just science-backed supplements to support your hard work. Click the link in the show notes or head on over to outworknutrition.com and sign up for our email list to get 10% off your first order. Next thing I changed my mind on, meal frequency. Again, you got to understand, when I got into bodybuilding, I did my first show in 2001. Now I'm really dating myself here. Did my first show in 2001, but I really started the idea of bodybuilding back in 2000. And the prevailing wisdom, air quotes wisdom, back then, was that you wanted to eat like every 2 or 3 hours. You wanted to keep a steady supply of amino acids coming into your bloodstream. And you would do that by making sure you're eating enough protein every 2 or 3 hours. This led to me walking around with cooked chicken breasts in my cargo shorts pockets. I wish that was a joke. It's actually not. I very clearly remember getting on a plane one time and my grandfather was with me. I had just gotten done graduating from college. And I pull a cooked chicken breast out of my pocket because I was prepping for a show and just started eating it right there. And the look on his face was not disappointment, but I would say like utter bewilderment would be like the phrase I would use. But it made sense. if you keep your amino acids in your blood elevated, you're going to keep protein synthesis elevated. You're going to be building muscle 24/7. In fact, I knew bodybuilders who would purposely wake themselves up at night to have another meal to spike their amino acid levels more. Now, I say amino acids because when you eat protein, that's what it breaks down to in the body. So that's what's in your bloodstream, is those amino acids. And as we talked about, branched amino acids, specifically leucine, can increase the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So this all made sense. And the other reason that they said to eat more frequent meals is you would stoke the metabolic flame. And I can still remember seeing this on TV, somebody sitting around a log fire. He said, if I take all these logs and I dump them on the fire, yeah, it'll make a big flame, but it'll burn out in a few hours real fast. But if I just do a few logs every few hours, that flame is going to keep burning. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I cannot tell you how many absolutely 100% false things had the phrase, it just makes sense, attached to them. It happens all the time. Your body is not a furnace. It's not a fire. You have to test these things. When I looked into it, years down the road, getting into graduate school, the research did not support the effect of meal frequency on fat loss when you equated calories between diets. And this was like anywhere from like 3 meals or 2 meals a day to 18 meals a day. I mean, there were some pretty extreme experiments out there. And, now we've got intermittent fasting, which some people like, the OMAD diet, eat once a day, or alternate day fasting, and those are claiming to be superior. So we've swung the pendulum from one side of the spectrum to the other. But just keep in mind the idea of these things happen on a 24-hour basis. If you eat one meal, it's going to be a big meal. And yeah, you're going to store a lot of that food in adipose tissue. But then you have 23 hours where you're not eating. And guess what's going to happen? Over time, your body is going to start drawing on some of that energy it stored, and you are going to burn some of that. Now, if you eat, say, 8 meals a day, once every 2 hours, at each meal, they're going to be much smaller if you're equating calories, comparing that to the 1 meal a day. Each meal is going to have a lot less calories, so you're not going to be storing very much at each meal, but you're also not going to be burning that much either because you're constantly eating. The net effect over 24 hours is 0. It does not seem to matter on the actual loss of body fat. Let's go to the anabolic claims that you want to keep your amino acid levels elevated. So my first experiment, the first one that actually worked, was looking at the duration of muscle protein synthesis in response to a meal. We found something really interesting in that study. Protein synthesis, we got that data back first. Protein synthesis increased and peaked at 90 minutes post-meal, and then went back to baseline by 3 hours. So you kind of got this nice bell-shaped curve. But then when we started looking at the amino acid levels in the blood and even inside the cell, we saw something interesting. The amino acid levels were still peaked out at 3 hours. Leucine was still at a peak at 3 hours and didn't even fully fall back to baseline even at 5 hours. And I can remember running the plasma data probably 3, 4, 5 times. I kept rerunning it and rerunning it and rerunning it. And finally, Layman called me into his office and said, where are we with this duration experiment? And I was like, yeah, I'm almost done. I just got to rerun the plasma data because it's wrong. And he said, why do you think it's wrong? And I explained that, okay, this doesn't make sense. We know that leucine stimulates muscle protein synthesis. So however long leucine is up in the blood should be how long protein synthesis stays up. And he said, well, is your technique bad? And I kind of walked him through how I was doing things. He said, oh, no, sounds like you're doing it right. He said, your standard error bars are good. How many times have you done this? And I was like, this is 3 or 4 times now. I can't remember exactly how many times I ran it, but it was multiple times. And they all showed the same thing. And he said, probably one of the most impactful phrases that I've heard as a scientist. He said, it sounds like you are trying to change the data to fit your conclusion And what you need to do is change your conclusion to fit the data. When I look back through the research literature, I also found a research study where they infused amino acids into people for 6 hours and found that protein synthesis went up, went back down, and then never went back up again, even though they kept continuously infusing those amino acids. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, then maybe eating 8 meals a day is not the best idea. The coolest part of my PhD is the results changed the way I ate. So I actually went from eating 7 to 8 meals per day down to 3 to 5. And this phenomenon we found, which was muscle protein synthesis dropping back to baseline, even in the face of elevated amino acid levels, is what we called the refractory phenomenon. Some people have called it the muscle full effect. So essentially, leucine and protein is important to start the system, but once it's going, it doesn't necessarily appear like just pushing more into the system is going to make you have more muscle protein synthesis. And you might even need a little bit of space in order for it to quote unquote reset, although that's much more debatable. But long story short, I went from eating 7 to 8 meals a day to eating 3 to 5. And I didn't notice any worse effects on my body composition. In fact, I felt much better, and it felt much easier because now I didn't have to walk around with cooked chicken breasts in my pockets all the time, because I always felt like before, if I left my house, I got to take stuff with me because, if I can't get back to the house to eat in 2 hours, I'm going to have to eat when I'm out. Whereas if you're eating every, 3 to 5 hours, gives you a lot more leeway for doing things socially. Now, that being said, I also recommended against intermittent fasting around that time, which is about 2010. My research essentially showed that you couldn't make up for like eating low or no protein at one time of the day by eating a crap load of it at another time of the day. And that's because there appears to be a threshold effect of protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So if it's below this threshold, you're not going to get stimulated. And once you hit a certain threshold, as we talked about, just pumping more in isn't going to jack it up even more or make it go longer necessarily. Distributing your protein seemed like a reasonable idea because then you could maximize the number of stimulations of muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. But if you're intermittent fasting and you're limiting your feeding window, then it stood to reason that it would be a negative towards muscle mass. And I can remember doing an interview around 2010 about intermittent fasting and got a lot of hate from the intermittent fasting crowd. I guess some things never change. But I have evolved my thinking on even that, because while more extreme forms of intermittent fasting like alternate day fasting or 5-2, or maybe even like short feeding windows of less than 6 hours, those in some studies do show a negative impact on lean mass. But there are a few studies now pretty consistently demonstrating that when you talk about traditional intermittent fasting like 16-8, if somebody is resistance training and they are consuming 3 protein-containing meals in that 8-hour feeding window and they're resistance training within their feeding window, those research studies showed no difference between people doing intermittent fasting versus people doing kind of a regular meal pattern on the accrual of lean tissue. So at least for more moderate forms of intermittent fasting, as long as you're resistance training and getting enough total protein in, it doesn't appear to have a negative effect on body composition. That said, these studies are short term, and I would tell you, if you are just somebody who's interested in building muscle, you can absolutely build muscle on intermittent fasting. But if you're somebody like me and you want to be the most muscular, strongest human being you possibly can, you're probably better off doing kind of a normal continuous meal pattern. And as my friend Peter Attia says, from a practical standpoint, a lot of the problem with intermittent fasting is because people are shortening their feeding window. A lot of them by default just end up not eating enough protein overall. So again, if you're eating enough protein, it seems like, the 16-8 intermittent fasting can work. But if you are not being intentional with your protein intake, then intermittent fasting may be problematic from a practical perspective because some people just don't eat enough protein unless they're being very intentional with it. Okay, let's talk about a fun one. The next one, LDL cholesterol and saturated fat. Now, this is something that I think is cool to talk about. I love the lab that I was in for graduate school, and I love Dr. Layman. I got such a great education. I got such a great experience. But they were skewed a little bit towards the low carb side of things. That's not a bad thing. That's just kind of the whole bias thing we talked about before. And bias, everyone has bias. I want to emphasize that. Everyone has bias. What's important is people who are honest about their bias. Somebody who says, oh, I don't have any biases. Those usually are the people with the strongest biases. The prevailing thought in that community at that time, circa 2005, was that LDL cholesterol didn't really matter. It was more about the HDL to LDL ratio and the type of LDL, that you didn't really have to worry about like native LDL or large fluffy LDL. What you were worried about is small oxidized LDL. And some of the shorter randomized control trials where people reduced saturated fat did not show an impact on cardiovascular disease. And so that led some people to say, saturated fat doesn't really matter for cardiovascular disease. LDL doesn't really matter. And it probably wasn't until about, the last 5 years where I started talking to some lipid specialists who really understood the mechanism behind how LDL damages the endothelium, and as well as reading these new Mendelian randomization studies that started probably about 10, 15 years ago. And that started to change my view on LDL and saturated fat. Let's talk about LDL cholesterol. So you've got VLDL cholesterol, you've got LDL cholesterol, you've got IDL, which is intermediate density, and you've got HDL. And you can categorize these all different kinds of ways. Some people say, well, you want to look at all non-HDL cholesterol as equally atherogenic, which is actually probably accurate. So what changed my mind on this stuff? Mechanistically, we know that LDL cholesterol can penetrate the endothelium. Okay, so the endothelium is like the lining of your blood vessels. Whether it's large, fluffy, or small and oxidized, both can penetrate the endothelium. Now, the small LDL penetrates the endothelium more easily, but it carries and deposits less total cholesterol. The large LDL does not penetrate the endothelium as easily, but the particles that do carry more total cholesterol and deposit more of it. And so the net effect is they are both equally atherogenic. And VLDL is atherogenic because even though it is much larger, it also can still penetrate the endothelium and carries much more cholesterol along with it. IDLs can penetrate the endothelium, but they carry much less cholesterol. So the net effect, and I'm probably painting with a broad brush, but the net effect is that all non-HDL cholesterol tends to be relatively similar in terms of how atherogenic it is. Now, why is it atherogenic? Each of these what's called lipoproteins, so things like LDL, VLDL, even from the diet chylomicrons, because fats are not water soluble, you have to transport them in the bloodstream in kind of like these, essentially like fat droplets, okay? So the fats tend to form into these things, and the liver packages them up in these lipoproteins. So you have these fats, and on each particle, whether it's LDL, IDL, VLDL, there is one ApoB protein. And there's different forms of ApoB. But ApoB is very important for this. And ApoB is actually what causes the damage. So when these particles penetrate the endothelium, they can pass one way, but the problem is ApoB gets enzymatically modified within the intima, within the blood vessel wall, that causes it to be retained. So that enzymatic modification causes that particle to be retained with all the cholesterol it brings with it, all the fats it brings with it. And then when those things start getting deposited in the intima, that causes the body to recruit different things to that area, like inflammatory markers, inflammation to the area. It also recruits macrophages and can cause the development of foam cells. And this is the progression of atherogenesis. People of the low carb ilk will try to tell you, well, it's not the LDL that's causing this, it's the inflammation. No, the inflammation is in response to the enzymatic modification of ApoB particles, causing them to be retained within the endothelium, and the inflammation is in response to that injury, that insult. So that's the mechanism. But we've talked about mechanisms. You have to have outcomes. Well, a lot of the problems with the studies that try to examine this is the durations. So you've had some randomized control trials that didn't really show differences between high saturated fat, low saturated fat, and the incidence of cardiovascular disease. Some did, but some didn't. Why? Well, you have to understand cardiovascular disease is not something that develops in months or years. Cardiovascular disease develops over the course of decades. And so the longest you can really run a good randomized control trial with any sort of actual control is maybe a year or two. How many of you would let somebody tell you what to eat for 2 years? There's not a whole lot of people out there who will do that. And even at 1 or 2 years, it is not going to be a very well-controlled study. It's going to be pretty free-living. And even at 2 years, what is the likelihood that you're going to see cardiovascular disease events, and enough of them to have statistical differences? So the comparison I like to make is, if I invest in a mutual fund and I get 15% interest, and somebody else invests in a fund that gets them 14%. If we look at our money after a couple years, it's going to look pretty similar. I'll have a little bit more, but for all intents and purposes, it'll be the same. But if we look after 40 years, it's going to be a massive difference. You've got to think about cardiovascular disease like that. If you're looking in a very narrow window, it's unlikely you're going to see differences. You have to look out for a long period of time. The problem is you can't do randomized control trials for 30 years. So what are you left with? You can do what are called cohort studies. Now, cohort studies, there's no actual intervention. You're not telling people what to do. You are simply observing people over time, and then you are attempting to correlate their behaviors with whatever you want to correlate with. So saturated fat intake and incidence of heart disease. And those cohort studies do tend to show that saturated fat increases the risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality. But again, the problem is the whole healthy user bias. Is this an effective saturated fat, or do these people tend to have more unhealthy habits and lifestyle overall? And that's where Mendelian randomization comes in. So what is Mendelian randomization? It is the idea that you have genetic polymorphisms in your genes that cause small differences in various things. Now, when it comes to LDL, there are genetic polymorphisms that cause people to be higher or lower secretors of LDL and have higher or lower lifetime exposure to LDL cholesterol in their bloodstream. And what's cool about this is these polymorphisms are randomly distributed. So they don't tend to affect other areas of metabolism. And so what you have essentially with MR studies is you have basically a lifelong human randomized control trial. Why is randomization important? Because when people self-select into different buckets in a study, if I do a study on muscle mass and protein, I say we're going to have a high protein group and a low protein group. Who wants to be in the high protein group? Who wants to be in the low protein group? And then at the end we go, well, the high protein group built more muscle. But that could be selection bias, because guess who's going to go in the high protein group? People who want to build more muscle, who are going to resistance train, who probably going to train harder, who are bodybuilders or want to be bodybuilders. Who's going to go in the low protein group? People who don't care about building muscle. So randomization, if I was randomizing, I would take people and just, you. And there's actually tools they use to randomize now, but you just randomly distribute them. And that way, if you have a difference in the outcome of your treatment, you can assume that it was due to the treatment and not inherent characteristic differences of your population. These Mendelian randomization studies are like lifelong human randomized control trials. And what do they show? Not only is your lifetime exposure to LDL cholesterol predictive of your risk of heart disease, you can pretty much draw a straight line through it. It is a linear effect. The more LDL you are exposed to for a longer period of time, the greater your risk of heart disease. And even people, if they take them from like average or low LDL to very low, you get a further reduction in risk. All those things combined made me change my mind about LDL cholesterol. And why does that relate to saturated fat? Well, saturated fat intake increases LDL production. And this gets into the whole seed oil argument because seed oils are mostly polyunsaturated fats. And it has been shown that when you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, it reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, even though the crazy seed oil people will refuse to admit that. But that's for another episode, another time. Hey guys, Lane here. And if you listen to my podcast, you probably love my research breakdowns. I don't put in a bunch of unnecessary fluff and scientific mumbo jumbo. I just give you the straight facts, but keep the nuance. And so if you love my research breakdowns, you'll love my research review reps. Research explained with practical summaries. Every month, my team of experts breaks down 5 studies in nutrition and fitness in a way that is palatable and easy to understand, even if you don't have a scientific degree. We tell you what the researchers tested, how they tested it, what they found, and what it means for you. And if we disagree with the researchers' conclusions based on their own data, we'll also tell you that. There's no BS, there's no fluff. We give you the straight facts. So if you're looking to up-level your brain and body gains, click the link in the show notes. So that's a lot of stuff to be wrong on so far, huh? Especially for an expert. But I'm afraid there's more. The next thing that I changed my mind on was sugar, as in like sucrose, table sugar, fructose, and high fructose corn syrup. It's important to understand kind of the makeup of different sugars. So you have monosaccharides, which are things like glucose, fructose, galactose, and then you have things like disaccharides, which sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose. So it is a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule hooked together. You have lactose, which is glucose and galactose. You have maltose, which is 2 glucose molecules. So you have monosaccharides, disaccharides. And then you have, for example, high fructose corn syrup, which is a mix, and on average is about 55 to 60% fructose. When I got to graduate school in 2004, my belief was that sugar, in particular fructose and high fructose corn syrup, were fattening and obesogenic beyond the calories that they contain. So meaning, I believe that these things were more fattening than other sugars or other form of carbohydrate, even when you equated energy between different groups. Now, my justification for this went something like the following. Sugar or sucrose is 50% fructose, high fructose corn syrup is 55 to 60% fructose, and fructose has been demonstrated to increase de novo lipogenesis in the liver. Sounds fancy. De novo lipogenesis is basically the production of fat from other substrates. So that made me very strongly feel like, okay, this fructose is increasing de novo lipogenesis, fructose, and sugars containing fructose are going to be bad. They're going to be obesogenic. And in accordance with that, sugar and high fructose corn syrup were associated with obesity. So if you look at sugar consumption, high fructose corn syrup consumption, and obesity, you see a pretty high association. Sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and fructose were also shown to decrease fat oxidation. There's that fat oxidation again. And I also believe that fructose in particular was worse than glucose because fructose can't be stored as muscle glycogen. So your muscle lacks the enzyme to turn fructose directly into glycogen. You have it in your liver. Your liver can turn fructose into glycogen, which is the stored form of carbohydrate. But also, fructose did not stimulate leptin production like glucose does. So leptin is a hormone that when we discovered it, we thought we'd found the cure for obesity. Leptin comes from I think it's the Latin word leptos, which means thin. And leptin, it's been shown that animals that lack the leptin gene get really fat. Animals that lack the leptin receptor get really fat. And it's because leptin is basically one of the big master controls of appetite. Okay, so if your leptin is high, it drives down your appetite. Glucose stimulates insulin, which tends to increase leptin. Fructose does not stimulate insulin really, and so it doesn't increase leptin. So you're getting the sugary taste without the positive effect on leptin that you get with glucose. So for all those reasons, I felt like fructose was uniquely bad for you, and by proxy, high fructose corn syrup and sucrose. And then something interesting happened my first year of graduate school. I was at a grad school mixer, and I overheard Manny Nakamura, one of the professors in the nutritional sciences division, talking about high fructose corn syrup. And Dr. Nakamura had done studies in rodents where they showed that a high amount of fructose basically turned on fat storage genes compared to other forms of carbohydrate. And the conversation I heard was not what I thought I was going to hear. There was another, I don't know if it was a grad school student or a professor talking to Dr. Nakamura, and they said something to the effect of, this is 20 years ago, so I'm paraphrasing, we know fructose or high fructose corn syrup is uniquely fattening. And Dr. Nakamura said, I don't think that's true. It's just a source of calories. And I remember thinking, but he did this research. He showed it turned on these genes. He said, we fed these rodents like over 60% of their calories from fructose, which is basically impossible. If you fed somebody nothing but high fructose corn syrup, literally nothing but it, you probably wouldn't get to 60% of calories from fructose. So he kind of was talking about how like the experiment was a proof of concept. It's not physiologically relevant in humans, et cetera, et cetera. So after listening to that conversation, it made me start to like rethink how I looked at this stuff. And so I started out looking for studies to prove my beliefs about sugar and fructose and high fructose corn syrup, which I was going to prove that it was uniquely fattening. And I found the opposite, that sugar, high fructose corn syrup, fructose was not uniquely fattening. In studies where they equate calories with either sucrose, fructose, or high fructose corn syrup, you do not see increased body fat deposition. You don't see people gain more weight. When you're exchanging them one per one with other sources of sugar or carbohydrate, they're not uniquely fattening. It was not what I thought would happen. It's not what I expected. But there was the data, so I had to change my mind. There was also like little evidence that sugars were uniquely deleterious for health compared to other carbohydrates or fats when you exchange them one per one for calories, other than maybe a small increase in LDL cholesterol. Most other cardiometabolic markers of health were not really affected by sugar consumption. In fact, when I left graduate school, I felt pretty strongly that diets high in sugar weren't bad because of the sugar. They were bad because they lacked satiety and because they tended to be low in fiber. If you're eating a lot of sugar, it's hard to eat enough fiber and it's not very satiating. But again, if we look at the differences between, say, fruit, which does have a high proportion of carbohydrate from different sugars, people who eat more fruit aren't fat. In fact, in research literature, people who eat more fruit tend to be leaner than people who eat less fruit. So again, that was another thing I changed my mind on. And we come to the final one. Now, I've probably changed my mind on more things than these, but these are the things that stand out to me. The final thing I changed my mind on, artificial sweeteners. Now, that's the popular term, but really what we're talking about is what's referred to as non-nutritive sweeteners. And the reason we call them that is because something like stevia is technically not an artificial sweetener because it's derived from something that's found in nature. So they call them non-nutritive sweeteners. But for our purposes, I'll just say artificial sweeteners because that's how people know them. So when I did my first bodybuilding show back in 2001, I had heard that artificial sweeteners were the same as soda. Like drinking diet soda was the same thing as regular soda. Like it's just as bad for you. The chemicals are bad. You're still going to gain body fat, So all I did was drink water, and the ideal was, well, it still has the sweet taste. Your body is thinking you're getting food. So you're stimulating an insulin release and it's going to cause you to gain body fat. And then other people say they also cause cancer. And then more recently, we've heard they ruin your gut microbiome. I started looking into the claims probably like around 2003, I'd say. The data didn't support what people were saying. And the studies that showed negative effects of artificial sweeteners were either completely correlational in nature, or they were ridiculously high doses in rodents. We're talking like 1,000, 10,000 times the dosage that you could ever get from consuming this stuff in the diet. All right, for those of you who watch my Instagram and YouTube, I'm going to do the thing. If you look at human randomized control trials, where they have people drink diet soda or diet drinks with artificial sweeteners in place of sugar-sweetened beverages, people lose weight very consistently. It is a very, very, very consistent effect in the research literature. Some studies have actually looked at, okay, if we tell people to drink diet soda in place of regular soda or water in place of regular soda, which one causes more weight loss? Guess which one causes more weight loss? Diet soda. Not water, diet soda. Now, this kind of shoots the whole artificial sweeteners are going to make you more hungry because of the sweet taste right in the foot. Because if people are losing more weight and more fat, taking in artificial sweeteners compared to water, then one of two things has to be true. Either artificial sweeteners are really good fat burners, or people taking in the artificial sweeteners are eating less than people taking in the water. Now, why would that be? Well, if you take somebody who's used to taking in sugar-sweetened beverages and you switch them to water, it stands to reason they may seek out that sweet taste somewhere else. But if you switch them to a diet soda, where they're getting that sweet taste occupied by something, perhaps they don't seek it out as much as they would people who are drinking water. It's hard to argue that artificial sweeteners are going to make you more hungry when the research literature shows that they lose more weight and consume less calories consuming artificially sweetened beverages compared to water. And as for the claims that it increases insulin, there's actually no evidence to support that. And really, if you have some basic physiology, you can kind of like map this out in your head. So you take in artificial sweeteners, you're not actually getting glucose. Okay, so typically glucose increases in the bloodstream. That stimulates insulin to be released by the pancreas, and insulin helps lower blood glucose by shuttling it into the periphery, like muscle and fat tissue. If you are not taking in any glucose and your insulin goes up, it's still going to shuttle glucose into cells. And so your blood sugar is going to drop. And so if it truly caused an increase, a significant increase in insulin, you would have episodes of hypoglycemia every single time you took in artificial sweeteners. That doesn't happen. Therefore, they don't stimulate insulin. And now we have the research literature to back that up. Now, there was one study, a single study, got a lot of press, that showed, okay, when you give sucralose alone, it doesn't stimulate insulin. But if you give sucralose plus carbohydrate, it stimulates more insulin release than if you just gave carbohydrate alone. And this is where looking into the specific details of a research study make all the difference. And this is why we dive into this in my research review reps, my monthly research review. Because if you just read a conclusion from authors or the abstract, a lot of times you're going to miss out on this stuff. This study suffered from an inappropriate control group. Now, it wasn't inappropriate for their primary outcome. Their primary outcome was they were actually looking at, I think, fMRI imaging of brain activity and looking at the differences between sucralose by itself or carbohydrate plus sucralose or carbohydrate alone. In order to do that, they wanted to match the sweetness between the groups. The carbohydrate only group I believe was either getting sucrose or fructose. I can't remember exactly which one, but it was either sucrose or fructose, which is a pretty sweet sugar. Fructose is very sweet. The group getting sucralose was obviously just getting sucralose. The group getting carbohydrate plus sucralose got maltodextrin. Now, maltodextrin is much less sweet than sucrose or fructose, but maltodextrin causes a much bigger insulin response compared to fructose or sucrose. In fact, maltodextrin causes a greater insulin response than pure glucose. Who is actually surprised that the group that got the maltodextrin had a bigger insulin response than fructose or sucrose? I'm not. It's not because sucralose has some magic effect when you pair it with carbohydrate. It's because the control group wasn't appropriate. Now again, for their primary outcome, it was, but not for their secondary outcome that they measured. So if they really wanted to test this and they wanted insulin to be their primary outcome, they should have used the same carbohydrate treatment across groups. But they didn't, and therefore their conclusions based on that data were not accurate. So again, artificial sweeteners do not stimulate insulin production. It is also a popular claim that non-nutritive sweeteners or artificial sweeteners cause cancer. That is not supported by data. The data is all over the place with that. Many more studies show it doesn't have an association with cancer versus it does. I think like 80% show no association or a possible association. Over 80%. And like when you go into Consensus, which is an AI tool for research I use, 0% show yes in humans. Like there is no conclusive human data. Artificial sweeteners cause cancer. But well over 60% outright say no. And the rest is all possibly, maybe, whatever. But even the ones that show it, and I'm thinking of a very specific study that's a great example as to got reported as artificial sweeteners are associated with cancer, but when you dig into it more, it doesn't make sense. So this was the Nutrisanti cohort out of France, I believe. It was like 100,000 people. I think it was over 20-year time period. And the big headline takeaway was that I think it was that aspartame was associated with cancer. And I think it was the 17% increase in relative risk. I probably ought to go into what relative risk means. I think I covered it on a previous episode, but let's talk about it one more time. So relative risk, a 17% increased relative risk is not, oh, your risk of X goes from 5% to 22%. No, it's more like your risk of X goes from 5% to like 5.8%. Okay? 17% of 5% is a little bit under 1. So then you add that to 5 and you get like 5.8, 5.9%. So it's a small absolute increased risk, but it sounds much scarier than it really is. The reason I don't buy these outcomes is because they had 3 categories in this study. There was like people who never consumed it or like rarely consumed it, low to moderate consumers, and then like high consumers. The 17% increased risk was in the low moderate group compared to the people who didn't consume it, which then went down in the high consumption group. I am not aware of any carcinogens that at a low to moderate dose are carcinogenic, but if you up them further, they become less carcinogenic. That's not how that stuff works. So again, this got reported as aspartame is associated, linked with cancer. Ooh. Except nobody actually read the full study or actually understood like why that doesn't make sense. And then we have the effects on the gut microbiome. The effects on the gut microbiome are also inconsistent. And even studies that demonstrate changes in the gut microbiome, we don't know enough about the gut microbiome to know if these changes are bad, good, or neutral. We just don't know that much. We do know that not all artificial sweeteners have an impact on the gut microbiome. Sucralose and saccharin in particular do appear to change the gut microbiome in people who have never consumed them versus people who start consuming them. But what we also know about the gut microbiome is pretty much any dietary shift changes the gut microbiome. We only really know a few things about the gut microbiome. Fiber is good. Soluble fiber seems to be really good for the gut microbiome. Don't eat too many calories or become obese. That seems to be bad for the gut microbiome. Exercise seems to be good for the gut microbiome. And too much saturated fat appears to be bad for the gut microbiome because of the bile end products. Some of those appear to be toxic to some of the microbiome. But I'll give you an example as to why this stuff is kind of weird. There was one study that showed that sucralose changed the gut microbiome. Oh man, oh no. But sucralose also increased a species of bacteria that was associated with greater butyrate production and was associated with lower rates of obesity and better metabolic health. So based on that study, couldn't you argue that sucralose actually improves your gut microbiome health? I'm not saying that. I'm not claiming that. I'm just saying that we don't know yet. And I'm a big fan of, I think it's Ron White who said this, shoot the alligator closest to the boat. So if you are 50 pounds overweight and switching to a diet soda containing sucralose that may change your gut microbiome helps you lose 50 pounds. And by the way, every time I do a post about these, I get people who say I lost 20, 30, 50, 100 pounds just from switching out from regular soda to diet soda. It can be a powerful effect for a lot of people. Because if you're drinking 4 sodas in a day, which people can easily do, I mean, that's like 200 grams of sugar right there. That's 800 calories. You cut 800 calories out of your diet for a long period of time, you're going to lose some weight. You're going to lose a lot of weight. So again, let's say let's theoretically say sucralose did have a small negative impact on the gut microbiome. If somebody loses 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds by switching to diet soda, are you really going to argue that they're better off with this small improvement in the gut microbiome from not consuming it versus losing that weight? Which, oh, by the way, obesity is also bad for the gut microbiome. This is a both and situation, not either or. If you can drink water, cool, no big deal. Awesome. Water's great. But if you're somebody who drinking diet soda helps you with your sweet tooth, or using some of these artificial sweeteners help you get your actual sugar consumption down and get your calories down, they seem to be great tools for a lot of people. So I'm just saying, let's not demonize them. And so that's it. That's some of the main things I've changed my mind on over the years. And I tried to kind of walk you guys through the time course of why I believed what I believe. And if you go back, some of it was like, oh, I heard a person say this, and that formed my like entire belief system for years around something. And then it took years and reading lots of studies to unravel that. A lot of times we can trace back our belief about something to something relatively small, not even based on a lot of evidence. And so again, I implore you, if the goal for you is to be more informed, is to be more evidence-based, if it's to be cutting edge scientifically, then have an open mind. Be open to the idea that you could be wrong, that your beliefs could be wrong. And the reality is, if you're a human being, you have some beliefs that are wrong. I'm sure I still have things that are wrong. I am sure there are things I am saying right now that are wrong. Now, I think if I end up being wrong, I probably didn't plant my flag very hard. You know, the proportion to which I emphasize something is usually proportionate to the data. If I plant my flag really strong, it's because I've seen a lot of data. If I'm a lot more cautious, if I have more trepidation, if I use a lot more of those couching terms like maybe, possibly, then I haven't seen as much data. I'm leaning towards one way, but unless I've seen like some pretty significant data, it's going to take me a while to really dig in something. And even then, even if I get really dug in, I'm always open to the idea that I could be wrong. But it's not going to be changed based on a single study, especially if I've already seen a lot of data to the contrary. It's going to be based off of consensus of data over time. So I hope that was helpful to you guys. If you guys like the show, make sure you leave us a 5-star rating and gush about it on wherever you listen to this podcast, Spotify, Apple, whatever. Leave us a good rating. Help us get ranked. I'm new, trying to make a positive impact. Appreciate you guys listening, watching, however you consume this content, and I'll catch you next time.